Guys, I'm really thrilled to welcome to the podcast a friend of mine, Cathy Alynn. She is the writer and director of the film Roe v. Wade. By the way, the film is at roeVWademovie.com. Now, Cathy is an independent film producer, writer. She's served as head of production for Big Picture, and she's produced all these cool films. Alien Abduction, a sci-fi thriller with Lawrence Bender. The Experiment, starring Adrian Brody, and Forrest Whitaker and Stephen T.K.'s thriller Isolation. Cathy, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of doing films that convey stories, but stories that deal with current events. Why did you make the Roe v. Wade movie?
Well, thank you so much for having me today, Dinesh. And it is an important conversation. You know, mainstream films at the moment are driven mostly by a very liberal agenda. And so to me, it's very important to make narrative films as well as documentaries like yours that showcase topics that are relevant to today's news. So for example, my film Roe v. Wade goes along with the history of how that law that legalized abortion in the United States was passed in 1973. So we tell the true story of exactly how that case came to the Supreme Court, how it passed, and all of the manipulations and conspiracies and fake news that went along with it back in the 70s. And that's super important because, as we all know, history repeats itself. And what happened in the 70s is not much different than what happened today in so many ways.
Debbie and I saw the film and we found it riveting because, well, it's a feature film, as you say, but it's revealing all this true new information that people don't have. And you could have made it as a documentary in which you interview sources, but you chose to do it as a story, a feature film. Is that because the medium of the feature film in some cases is a better way to reveal history than the documentary approach?
You know what? I think that they're both useful. I think that narrative feature films have their place in the sense of the audience doesn't feel like you're trying to shove anything down their throat. They don't feel like they're in an educational setting in a lesson. A story is a little bit easier to digest. It's dramatic. There's characters that you could follow along with, some familiar faces like John Voight and Stacey Dash and Robert Davi that people can be fans of. And when you're hearing a story told by such prolific actors that you love, sometimes it sinks in a little bit better. And then maybe you get so interested in the topic that you'll then dig deeper and watch a great documentary that'll interview the real sources. I've certainly found a lot of people that have seen our film then go and look up interviews with the different Supreme Court justices and the different key players at the time. And that was the whole point of making the movie. All of this information that we showcased is all available to the public. It's not hidden information. I mean, Margaret Sanger, for example, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, wrote in her own autobiography that her goal in forming Planned Parenthood was to, quote unquote, reduce Negro populations. That's a quote from Margaret Sanger's own autobiography, which is on print, on Amazon, available for everyone to buy. This is all accessible information. We were able to condense it into one place, into a story that you can watch in 2 hours that maybe would spark your attention to say, hey, let me look into that a little bit further. And so we did actually make a website at roeVWademovie.com with all of the sources that were used for the film, similar to how you would do in a documentary, because we wanted people to be able to fact check us. So there's a whole fact check page on our website where everyone could see for themselves what those sources are. And I do find that at least my generation, the millennials and below me, Gen Z, we want to know for ourselves that something is true. When someone tells us something, we want to Google it. We want to say, I don't know if I trust you. I want to see for myself. And that's really important. So we just wanted to spark the idea and then let people run with it once they saw the story.
I mean, part of the story that is revealed in the film is that the justices who are considering the Roe v. Wade matter as a legal matter were leaning one way. And then there was a sort of campaign that evidently included not just the media on the outside, but also a kind of network of relatives and let's call them influencers, using the phrase we use these days, on the inside to change their mind, not on legal grounds, but on other grounds. So talk a little bit about how the film brings this to light and shows that, what many people think, the Supreme Court looked at the Constitution, they identified a fundamental right, and what you show is, well, that's not really what happened.
Well, I'll start by saying that, when researching this film, we were told that there was a symposium at Stanford, a law symposium hosted by the Federalist Society, where it was agreed upon by this symposium of lawyers on both sides of the argument that Roe v. Wade was one of the worst legal decisions in Supreme Court history, not because they were pro or against abortion, but legally how it was decided. Now, tying that into what you're asking, Supreme Court justices are not robots. They are humans. And we are all affected by the media, our families, things that are going on in our own homes. In this specific case, we had Supreme Court justices with wives and daughters who were volunteering at Planned Parenthood, who were influenced by this huge feminist movement that was sweeping the nation in the late 60s and 70s. So it's almost to say, if you're talking about the George Floyd case, for example, against Derek Chauvin, how could you say that the judges in that case wouldn't be influenced by what's going on in the media or what's going on in their own homes? That environment that we all experienced in the summer of 2020, the BLM movement, is very similar to what you could picture the environment that the justices were experiencing back in the 70s when this case was decided. And not only that, on top of the family pressure that they all saw right in their own homes, there was a leak. Just like there was a leak right before the new Roe v. Wade decision got overturned, there was a leak where one of the justices leaked the internal vote. There's internal votes that happens before the justices decide something. They have this big case coming up, and while they're in their meetings, they're deciding, hey, what are we looking at now? How many are for it? How many are against it? These are confidential internal votes that take place in the Supreme Court. One of the justices was very unhappy that the vote was swaying towards continuing to make abortion illegal. So he then leaked that internal vote to the Washington Post. And there was a huge story in the Washington Post about how Chief Justice Warren Burger, who in our film was played by Jon Voight, was leaning towards keeping abortion illegal. Now, you can only imagine the death threats, the family pressure, what he would then receive once the country knew that he was voting against legalizing abortion. Remember what happened to Justice Gorsuch or Amy Coney Barrett or our current justices once the new Roe v. Wade decision was leaked. People showed up at their homes. There were protests. There were death threats. History is simply repeating itself.
I mean, what's so fascinating with all this, Cathy, is that there are some people who think, and maybe this is just a distorting effect of memory, that, going back to the 70s and 80s and 90s, this sort of thing didn't happen, that we lived in a kind of kinder, gentler America, and all this sort of journalistic terrorism and putting ideological pressure or threats against justices. And I think what you're saying is that it did happen, and particularly on this exact same issue. So this is a fascinating film, guys. You need to see it. Go to RoeVWadeMovie.com. Is that the best place, Cathy, for people to check out the film?
Absolutely. You'll find links to all your favorite streaming providers on that site, whether you want to watch it on iTunes or Amazon or whichever you prefer. That's the hub where you can find the film.
Great stuff. Cathy Alynn, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dinesh.